Have you ever been in a game where your knight is pinned down and unable to move, leaving your position vulnerable? Don't worry, because in this video, we are going to show you how to deal with those annoying pins on your knights. So stick around if you want to improve your chess skills and learn how to defend against this common tactic. The pins on our knights can sometimes be very annoying because we are unable to move our knight elsewhere, as that would just leave the piece that's pinned to the knight vulnerable. So for example, in this case, if we move our knight away to any squares, our queen would be under attack from the enemy's bishop. So the first tip, which is the simplest and easiest way to defend against these pins, are to defend against the pin with your own bishop. So now our bishop is in front of the queen and our knight would be able to move on the next move. So for example, let's say black plays here, we can move our knight anywhere, and at most, black would only achieve a trait of bishops. Similarly, we could also defend this side of the pin with our bishop as well. So that's number one. Pretty easy, right? Now let's take a look at a scenario where we have already developed our bishop and push up our pawn. So our bishop would be unable to retreat to defend against this pin anymore. Or our bishop has been traded away and we can't use it to defend. So number two would be defending the pin with your other knight. So we just bring our other knight over like this, and the knight on d2 will support the knight on f3. However, in this situation, our queen is still under pin from the bishop, so we are still unable to move this knight away. Otherwise, our queen would be under attack. Now you might notice that by doing so, we kinda trap our own bishop from developing this way. However, don't worry, because as long as our bishop can develop in another way, our position would be fine. So for example, let's say black plays a move this, we can play pawn to b3, and then we look to develop our bishop along this diagonal instead. And if black decides to capture the knight, we can either capture back with the queen, or we could also capture back with the other knight that we brought in to support. So in the same position where we are unable to bring our bishop back, or our bishop has been traded away, the third tip to defend against pins is to kick away the bishop. So we can play a move like pawn to h3, threatening to capture the bishop on the next move. Now our opponent has a choice. He can either capture our knight, or he can retreat the bishop. If he retreats the bishop anywhere this way, let's say here, now there's no longer the annoying pin on our knight, and our knight is free to move. However, if he decides to move his bishop back this way instead, trying to keep the pin on our knight, now in this position, we can actually punish this move by playing the very aggressive pawn to g4. We continue chasing the bishop only has one move left to go back, bishop back, and now if we have a pawn on f4, we can just push it up and the bishop is already trapped. Of course, earlier on in this position, black could capture our pawn with the knight, capture back and bishop capture. He could sacrifice a piece, either the knight or the bishop, for 2 pawns, but we're still in a material advantage. So that's good for us. So now let's take a look at another position. Same scenario, we try to kick away the bishop. If the bishop goes back this way, now there's no more pin. But in this case, black can retreat back this way because we do not have our pawn on f4. So even though we can play pawn to g4, black can now retreat the bishop this way, and we no longer have our f-pawn to push up to trap the bishop. In this case, it's still perfectly fine to do so, as we successfully defend against the pin once again. However, do be careful, as pushing up your kingside pawns might create some weaknesses along the king. So for example, let's say we castle first and black plays some developing move. Now, if we try to kick the bishop away and play pawn to g4 as well, black can just retreat again. We cannot trap the bishop yet, and because our king has castled on the king side, by pushing up our pawns, we might create opportunities for our opponent to attack us on the king side. So be careful. But before we dive deeper into our discussion on dealing with pins on your knights, I'd like to remind you to smash that like button and subscribe to our channel if you're finding this content valuable. By doing so, you'll never miss any of our future chess videos. So let's get back to the topic at hand. And tip number 4 is just to ignore the pin and do nothing. So sometimes we can ignore certain pins because, for example, in this position, even though the bishop is attacking our knight, as long as we do not move our knight, we have our queen and our g-pawn to protect our knight. So only one attacker, but we have two defenders. So in certain cases, we can just ignore the pin and continue with our development. So instead of kicking the bishop away, we can just play a move like castling, and we just try to finish our development. For example, a move like here, just develop our pieces as usual and ignore the pin, because as long as black has no threats to utilize with this pin, we don't have to worry about it in certain cases. So now let's take a look at scenarios where we need to watch out for potential threats from your opponent by utilizing the pin they have on our knight. So for example, in this case, the black bishop attacks our knight, the queen attacks the knight as well. So black has two attackers and we have two defenders, the queen and the pawn. The amount of attackers and the defenders are still the same, so we do not lose any material. However, if let's say we do not protect the knight and we play, let's say, a move like this, black can capture our knight. And let's say we take back with the queen, capture, and now we are left with this double isolated pawns. So even though we do not lose any material, sometimes or most of the time we will want to avoid letting our opponent attack us and cause our pawn structure to become like this, because now both our pawns are on the same file and they are quite weak because the pawns do not defend each other. So we would like to try and avoid that. So a simple way to avoid getting our pawns doubled and weak, whenever our opponent has an equal number of attackers on our knight, we just have to bring in another defender to protect our knight. So now if black captures, we can just capture back with the bishop and our position will not have any problems. The other thing we need to watch out for is black might try to use the pin and push his pawn like this, advancing his pawns to attack our knight, because he knows that our knight would be unable to move as we will lose our queen. So for example, in this position, if we play, let's say, a random careless move, now black can just push up his pawn to e4, and both the pawn and the bishop attacks the knight. As mentioned, if we move the knight away, we lose our queen to the bishop. So our knight is tied down, unable to move, and if now we defend with the bishop, he can just capture the knight, and even though we capture back the pawn, we have already lost a knight for just a pawn. So watch out for these two types of threats and attacks that your opponent might use when he has a pin on the knight. Now tip number 5 is to prevent the pin from happening in the first place. So if let's say we want to develop our knight here, knight to f3, but we are worried that black would play bishop here to pin our knight to our queen, we can play pawn to h3 first ahead of time to prevent the bishop from coming to g4. So since black cannot put his bishop on g4, now we can bring out our knight without fear of being pinned. And also, we could do the same on the other side as well, playing pawn to a3, preventing the pin on our knight on c3, as black cannot play bishop to b4. However, there is one major drawback with this strategy. As you guys can see, black has already developed 4 pieces, both his knights and his bishops. However, as white, we have the first move advantage and we have only developed 2 pieces. So if we prevent pins ahead of time by pushing up our side pawns, h3 and a3, we actually hinder our own development and we will fall behind in development compared to our opponent. So that's just one major drawback for employing this strategy. And I would recommend you guys to just push up the pawn one side of the board to prevent the pin and not on the other side, because we will fall behind in development. So if you're really worried and don't want your opponent to pin your knight, you could always do so on one side of the board, usually on the king side, so that we want to get out our pieces quickly and castle as early as possible. And now we have the last and final tip for this video, and this tip is more advanced and would apply more towards intermediate or advanced players. And the tip is to look out for tactical combinations. So what do I mean by that? By looking out for tactical combinations, even though our knight is pinned by the bishop, we actually turn the tables on our opponent and utilize that pin to counterattack instead. So in this position, we actually have a pretty famous opening trap and an opening checkmate in the next few moves as well. For those of you who are familiar with this position, you should already know what to do. But for those of you who have not seen this position before, take a moment and pause the video if you like to try and solve this puzzle. White has an amazing idea and a brilliant move here, which is knight takes e5. So congratulations to those of you who found this move and the idea behind this move. And for those of you who are still unable to see the idea, you might take a look at this position and see, but wait, isn't our queen under attack? And black can just capture our queen, right? And now the whole idea of this sacrifice is white actually has a checkmate in the next few moves. So white can play bishop takes f7 check. The only legal move for black's king to go is here, king to e7, and now followed up with the other knight, knight to d5 is just checkmate and game over. And this checkmate is also known as the legal's mate. So a really nice combination involving the sacrifice of our queen to deliver checkmate in just 8 moves. Now let's go back to the position for a bit. Let's say black does not capture the queen. Black does not capture our queen because he saw the checkmate happening. And let's say he captures back with the pawn. Now the bishop is under attack and we can just capture the opponent's bishop with our queen and we gain back the piece while earning a pawn as we captured knight takes e5 with our knight in the first move. And if black captures with the knight instead, same thing, we just capture the bishop. And if black captures our bishop here on c4, we have this very nice check, queen to b5 check, hitting the king and winning back the knight on the next move. So let's say if black blocks with the pawn, we just capture back with the knight with our queen, and again we traded 2 pieces, our bishop and our knights, for our opponent's bishop and knight as well, but we gain the pawn on e5. Now don't go anywhere just yet because we have another brilliant tactical combination to show you guys. So it starts off with the French defense, and white will play the exchange variation in the French. And after a few normal developing moves, here comes the pin with the bishop, bishop to g4, white castles, and let's say if black decides to follow suit and castle as well, now we have another nice combination, tactical combination with our bishop and our knight, utilizing the pin to turn the pin around on our opponents instead. And now the tactical combination here is bishop takes h7. Because now if king takes, we play knight to g5 check. It doesn't matter where the king goes, and we capture the bishop with our queen. So overall, we capture back the bishop that we sacrificed, winning the pawn on h7, and white still has attacking chances, threatening queen to h5 and queen to h7 checkmate. And if black chooses to ignore the bishop by playing, let's say, king here, we can just retreat back our own bishop and we gain a pawn already. And that's it for a video on how to deal with pins on your knights. We've covered some essential tips and strategies to help you escape from these pesky pin positions on your knights. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more chess content. In the comments below, let us know which tip you found the most useful or which tip you'd like to try out in the real game. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.